Councilmember Wesley Hudson, Chair of Prosperity and Livability Committee, calling us to order this morning. In council chambers this morning, we have Councilmember Michael Holmes and Councilmember Monica Peters. Our first order is a discussion about the General Development Ordinance, and I'll pass over to Chris Andrews.
Well, good morning, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. Before you today is kind of a summary of what staff does with regular amendments to the development ordinance. We've kind of they used to be called miscellaneous amendments. It sounds kind of disjointed, but so we aim to take kind of an assessment of the development ordinance about twice a year, see if there's any areas of confusion, areas that we can kind of clean up. Are there typos? Is there clarification that staff can provide as the ordinance is being applied to rezonings or land development items that come in? So we aim to do that at least a couple times a year. So this would be the 10th round. And so there's a draft text amendment that's before you. There's no action that's needed or anything on this. This is what would be submitted to the Planning and Zoning Commission for their review and then subsequently to you for approval. Our aim at this point is to have this go to the April 25th Planning and Zoning Commission. We would typically also send notice out to the development community for their review, and so we can work on that as well. But let me go to the presentation here. In summary, there's 7 sections that are to be amended. 4 are clarifications as staff is looking at it. It says, all right, this definition is kind of confusing, or this misrepresents what the ordinance is intending to do. And then 1 is related to utility service at residences, and that's something that came up during just inquiries from residents when they're trying to gather permits. But there's 2 that are most impactful, and we'll highlight those today. 1 is the width standards for sidewalks in the city's mixed-use areas, mixed-use zoning districts, so that's both downtown and along Washington Street. And then a use standard for multifamily residential buildings or use types that have frontage along Main Street. And it's really just in 4 zoning districts. So we'll highlight those a little bit further here. So in the mixed-use downtown and mixed-use Washington area, there's kind of a blanket approach that was used to say sidewalks need to be 12 feet in width everywhere. And we've found through development review that maybe that doesn't necessarily work the best. And so that kind of lacks some context. So staff kind of took consideration of what are the goals of the development ordinance, as well as goals and policies that City Council has established, things like the mixed-use downtown area plan, and trying to accommodate a pedestrian experience, trying to provide sidewalk dining, street furnishings, and there's a realization that there's a lot of contention for sidewalk space, whether it's planters, street furniture, signage, what have you. So staff wanted to keep that in context. So last summer, we took a walking tour of the district and tried to walk almost every street in the mixed-use area and tried to gather what the context of all the streets are. So we had, Trevor was out there, we had public services, transportation planning. So we tried to walk around and know the district by foot before we proposed anything. So what you see depicted here is a representation of what will be described in text, but this is kind of the approach that staff came up with to, all right, so we're not going to do necessarily a blanket approach, but we will consider some streets that maybe don't warrant a 12-foot sidewalk, and what's the minimum that we'd feel comfortable going down to. And so after discussion and walk through the district, we kind of figured a minimum would be 8 feet for sidewalk width, which going smaller than that just doesn't provide as comfortable of a pedestrian environment. So the approach that we've kind of set up is a kind of a tiered approach or kind of an exemption, and say we will require 12 feet in the majority of the district, with exception of certain streets. So we've kind of laid a framework that even in the future, if there was, whether it's staff or an applicant says, you know what, this just doesn't warrant 12 feet here. We think we've gotten rid of those, but there's a framework set up that exemption could be done through a text amendment. So the areas in blue, we would maintain as a 12-foot sidewalk width, and then those ones in yellow, the text amendment would allow an 8-foot sidewalk. And so how it's structured in the development ordinance, that each district has street names and then what that alternate width would be. And at this point, we're proposing 8 feet for those streets. So the other streets included are shown on this map as well as listed in the table in your packet. So that is kind of the extent there. This did spring from a kind of a geometric issue with providing a 12-foot sidewalk for a development in downtown, and so in the mixed-use area. So that was a result of dialogue between an applicant and city staff, and then we kind of took it further to see where we could accommodate those concerns, but also stick to the desires and kind of policies for what the department and the rest of city staff see for the downtown mixed-use downtown area. Are there any questions about this approach? Because it's a fairly simple. From staff's perspective, it's a fairly simple change. So these are minor streets, at North Main, Elm, Church Street. These are all be pivotal streets for continued development in the district. All right, if no questions, I'll go to the next one. Well, not every, but many of the uses within the development ordinance have certain use standards. So, you may say a drive-through, or we call a major restaurant. It's got certain use standards. You can't have the speaker and the ordering station in the front of the building. It's got to be in the back. That's an example of a use standard. Within the development ordinance for multifamily residential, there are use standards. We talk about building placement, the length of buildings, the requirement for open space, recreational facilities, pedestrian connections, where utilities can be placed, and then allowing certain buildings in the core city to be reused for multifamily residential. So that's the extent of the use standards that we have. One that has come up is a proposed standard that would require some active uses along Main Street. So if a proposed multifamily building were to go in on Main Street, that there be a standard that on the ground floor, a certain portion of that would have to be some sort of active use, not necessarily front doors of units. So staff kind of took a look at neighboring jurisdictions, just kind of practices around the country. What does the American Planning Association or Congress of New Urbanism, what's some of the research that they've done? Tried to come up with I don't want to say an in-between, but something that we think would be able to be applied here. And so this would be a new use standard, letter H, that would require at least 50% of the ground floor frontage along Main Street to be dedicated to some sort of institutional or commercial use type. And all of those uses, this might be, any sort of commercial use, those are all spelled out in the development ordinance, or some sort of amenity that would commonly be found in a multifamily residential development. So talking about their offices, recreation areas, common areas, that sort of thing. And then the remainder would be able to be used any way that would be allowed in the district. So it could have some residential.
Is that 50% of the total square footage of the ground floor?
No, just the frontage. I mean, because the our perspective is that if you're standing on the street, whether in the, hopefully on the sidewalk, hopefully on the 12-foot sidewalk, as you look or you're traversing through the city, in a vehicle, that what you see on those buildings is impacting your experience of Main Street. And so, the depth of that maybe doesn't matter quite as much, or the square footage of it, but, do you have bays of retail or, bays of active uses? That's something that we think is probably more important than mandating what the square footage is. Yeah. And I'll have a diagram here in just a second to make sure we can visually see what this standard would be. So to give some description of what these institutional or commercial uses would be, there's a lot of uses that would be allowed there. So talking civic uses, daycares, educational uses, healthcare institutions, religious institutions, and then in commercial, eating establishments, offices, personal services, recreation and leisure. I mean, that runs it's a lot of uses is what I'm trying to say. And then some sort of active amenity, we touched on it, offices, recreation rooms, common areas, mail rooms, that sort of thing, gathering spaces for that development. So any combination of those would be able to be used for that 50% that's set apart. So this is an example if a developer were to come in with a multifamily building along Main Street, when it comes in for staff review, we would look and see, okay, on the building plans or on a site plan, what they're dedicating or how they're dividing up the building. And so we would ask the applicant, okay, what are you showing along this frontage? And as long as 50% of that width along Main Street is some use other than residential, we would generally be allowing that.
And I can't imagine that would be really an issue, because that's where you're going to make your money on ground floor businesses as well. You're not going to put a residential on ground floor. You'll make 10 times as much with commercial development.
It would certainly be up to the developer, depending on the type of leasing arrangements, whether they want to have to then lease to a commercial entity, how that's being set up. Maybe it's a company that only deals with residential. But as you go from city to city, I try to pay attention to this in visiting other places. I mean, there is a variety of how this is approached. And even our own Main Street, think about it. We've got Emerywood Court and Rowella right on the corner there. And I mean, those buildings have been part of Main Street for quite a long time. And you can have differing perspectives on it, but I think those frame the street very well. The sidewalk's pretty narrow there, but by and large, those are very neat buildings which have residential on the ground floor. So this would provide additional opportunities for that active use on the ground floor. So this standard would only apply to, again, the frontage of lots that are along Main Street, only within the city's Main Street B and C districts. And so Main Street has kind of a continuum of zoning districts. There's A and B on the north side, and then C and D on the south side of downtown, as well as the mixed-use downtown district and the central business district. So if we're looking on a linear path along Main Street, it's going to be from State Avenue all the way down to East Market Center. So any multifamily residential that would be proposed along that stretch, this standard would apply. And just for some other context, these districts, all the Main Street districts and downtown, they already have some standards for facade transparency, materials, where the entrances of the buildings can be, and then what the setbacks are. So we're not tinkering or proposing to tinker with anything, only what is the use on that bottom floor. So just for some comparison, some neighboring jurisdictions and then some other kind of peer cities. Greensboro doesn't address this at all. Neither does Winston-Salem, Chapel Hill, Salisbury, or Kannapolis. Boone is a city that does require 50 or 100% of the square footage. Again, that is a a different metric or a different way of calculating what the standard should be. It took some time to talk to the planners in Boone, and they kind of said it's a different environment. That they can't build enough student housing, so there's a big demand for multifamily residential as well as commercial close to campus, and then Concord as well. In their center city zoning, they require that the entire floor be devoted to some sort of use, so other than multifamily residential. So that's kind of the extent of some of the research at this point, and it is all over the board.
Concord still, I mean, their emphasis is still on building unified communities as well in that center city, right? So that you live and you never leave the perimeter.
Correct.
Basically.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
And when you have that new, I'm not super familiar with Concord, so I'm happy to be corrected. But when you have like newer planned development, whether it's a new downtown that has a master plan or whatnot, I think it's easier to substantiate that requirement. But anyhow, just to give some perspective, it's all over the board. And as staff looked, what are some other places around the country doing? American Planning Association publishes these zoning practice bulletins for certain issues, and one of them was activating the ground floors of mixed-use buildings. I mean, this says after COVID, but by and large, these jurisdictions are represented in there, and all of them were decreasing their standards in some way to say, all right, we're still going to require some sort of uses, but we'll open up the variety of them that would be allowed, or lessen the amount that's required. Or Grand Rapids, Michigan was kind of the outlier. They said we're going to allow ground floor residential. It's fine. So again, the general trend is that cities were moving away from the requirement that the entire floor be dedicated to retail or some other use. Just the challenge of getting tenants in there was kind of the summary. But so this is a quote from that report. The researcher at the end was essentially saying that these commercial centers and corridors would have to change, and that the areas would need to be downsized. Again, some of these are cities that have a dedicated corridor plan or a dedicated small area plan, but they recognize that, all right, we're gonna increase the variety of uses that would be permitted here. Any questions on that use standard as only applying to multifamily residential buildings? Okay, we'll keep moving. So there's two other small amendments I want to highlight. One is it's in that draft ordinance. There is section 1. When an application for a zoning amendment, whether it's a plan development or conditional zoning, comes to the council, an applicant, as it's written in the ordinance right now, has to have their final changes in 2 days before you make a decision. That's not a lot of time for staff to work back and forth if there's a big change in the condition. So staff is proposing to add some more time to that, to say 10 days. And that's something that we feel is a bit more comfortable and a bit easier for staff to work back and forth if it involves multiple departments. And there's also inconsistency in how it's written in there now. One says 48 hours, one says 2 days. We just want to make sure that things are written in the same fashion. So that'll be another proposed amendment. And then finally, there's a use standard for accessory buildings or accessory structures that a second utility connection can't be provided to them. This came up from a property owner that has an accessory building on a larger piece of property, and I don't know the rationale behind this or the science of it, but the power that he was getting at a distance was decreased over that distance and couldn't couldn't power what he was trying to power in his garage. So it just wasn't working. And so we looked at how can we structure the ordinance in such a way that, okay, maybe if you have a larger lot and have an accessory structure on that building, that we could allow a second connection. So we did take this standard to the TRC, so having electric department, give some feedback on it, we felt comfortable with going forward with this. So this would only apply to properties that are 2 acres in size, 2 acres in size or larger. So this wouldn't be, in a typical subdivision or anything like that, probably on the periphery of the city. But right now, it would require that if you had an accessory building or a residential accessory structure, that the utilities have to branch off from the main house. So this would be kind of an exemption to that, if that makes sense. But again, only lots that are 2 acres in size or larger. So it would be limited in scope.
Sorry, will you then have 2 connection fees as well?
I believe that would be the case. Yeah.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So that is it for the what's in front of you, or what this packet is in front of you. Staff did have one other kind of subject that we want to bring to light, and this is from response of review from TRC for subdivisions that we've gotten, or some zoning cases that we've seen recently, really related to single-family attached development. So this is townhouses. There's at least 3 big areas. There's a subdivision up down at Cox Avenue and Jackson Lake Road. There's the Bensini property that's at Skeet Club and I-74 on the northwest corner there, and then one at Old Mill Road. These are all zonings that have come through recently. And what staff has seen on the site plans and kind of preliminary drawings is that there's a lot of long stretches of attached housing. And it's not necessarily an issue of density, but perhaps an issue of design. And so staff, we're not taking any action, or we don't have anything written, but it's just kind of this is what's bubbling up in the department or within TRC. So some questions that kind of arise are, off-street parking requirements. When you have a townhouse community that doesn't have on-street parking because there's so many driveway cuts and areas, where do people park if you have a party or something like that? Where should open space be placed? Should it be easily accessible by the residents, or can it be, tucked away in kind of an afterthought? Should we have more active open space, like dedicated greens or areas where people can actively recreate? We do have a certain standard for that, but just evaluate: do you want more? Do you want less? How to break up that building wall? Kind of what's the facade as you stand on a street and look down? Is it kind of a monotonous wall? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? That could be up for discussion. It's not value judgment at this point, but in a lot of jurisdictions, they require that single-family attached homes be alley loaded. It can provide ease for trash pickup, for utility connections. It's just kind of an area where all of those services are managed in one stretch, as opposed to being divided up between the front and the back of homes. Sidewalk requirements. How do people actually experience and traverse the subdivision? Our ordinance is pretty lax on sidewalks. We only require them on one side of the street in most residential developments, and maybe not even on certain streets of a certain length. So when you go to some of these subdivisions, you might only have sidewalks on one side of the street. Is that something, is that a practice that we want to continue? And then alluded to this one, but trash collection, especially for public services. When you have a street that could potentially have on-street parking, but also have a bunch of driveways and all those toters out there, how do city services get provided along those streets? So those are questions that have come up, questions that get raised with staff. So it's been kind of laying out a roadmap here. You could take some immediate measures, or the city could take some immediate measures and maybe identify some small things to increase, off-street parking for visitor parking, that sort of thing. Might alleviate that. And that's something that could be done pretty easily, pretty quickly. But kind of these long-term measures of, just assessing these standards and saying, is this really what the product that we want for the city, as these seem to be growing in popularity? And then thinking about landscaping, trees, the view of what will this community look like in 40 years, and how to best manage that. So again, we have some use standards for single-family attached development. They're pretty minimal. So we talk about, or the development ordinance talks about the separation of buildings, 10 feet away, 10 feet from parking lots, so at least some distance. And then the number of units that can be attached at one time. So as you get in a more dense district, you can have more units next to each other. And then there's some other standards in there about setbacks and driveway length and open space requirements, but they're pretty general. And again, so staff has looked around the country who has some best practices. There's a document, Building Better Townhouse Communities, from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. It's just outside Philadelphia, that has some great examples. And these are some pictures from there. But single-family attached development comes in many forms, whether that's front-loaded with garages, whether that's rear-loaded with street parking, or whether that's this traditional row house development. Even though that's one building facade, there are multiple colors. I don't think this is in the U.S., but it still serves as a good example. This is a kind of a clip from one of the subdivisions that we've got. This, I don't want to give more context because there's not a formal submittal on this yet, but this is kind of what can be built right now. And you see where the buildings are, and then I don't know if I have a cursor. Yeah, you can kind of see all of these little hatched areas. Those are all driveways. So the question of, well, if somebody's in building CC here and is having a big shindig, where does everyone park? There's not a lot of street parking, that sort of thing. So those are all impacted by the design of these communities. This is another one. You can see a large stretch of these homes here. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? But all of these are front-loaded front-loaded townhomes. These are hundreds of units that are due to come online in the city. And then here's another one where you've got a large stretch with those driveways in the front, each unit having their own single driveway. So here's just threw together a couple comparisons of existing development within the city, and then some examples of some alternate ways to approach this from either around the region or the country. So the top there is Northborough, where you've got front-loaded buildings. You'll notice sidewalk only on one side, and then down below is Weldon Village, which is in Kernersville, where they've have kind of taken a different approach, where those are all front-loaded, rear-loaded with sidewalks on both sides of the street with street trees. So it's kind of a different approach, and something to see how other places have approached it. The top picture is the trellises. You can see Google Street View captured the toters being out there, and then down below is Weldon Village, where you can kind of see how sanitation would work with everybody's toters kind of being in the alley there, as well as mailboxes, and kind of all that service provision takes place kind of back of house, not out front. And the last one here, another trellises view, sidewalk again on one side of the street, and then Weldon Village with as you drive down the street, the principal feature that you see is the porches and the kind of the public realm, not necessarily the big garage doors and driveways. So just something to think about the experience of those.
While you stay on that one for
Yeah, sure.
a second. I will point out as someone who owns a service industry that when we work on a street like that, it's impossible for landscapers, construction companies, HVAC, all of those. It's very hard to find places to park to actually service.
You mean the top image or the bottom
The
image?
top one.
Top image, okay.
The top image, when you have so many driveways in a row, it's very hard to.
Yeah, that's a great
We
consideration.
have 4 or 5 trucks that show up at a time, so it's
Sure.
very hard to service that
Sure.
type design.
And, staff isn't necessarily saying this is got to be exactly what happens, but we've got to start forming can we possibly make some changes here? And this is Copperfield Glen in High Point here, just another perspective of single family attached that's recently been built. And then I like this example. This is, again, Montgomery. I said, all right, if Montgomery County, Pennsylvania is writing this document, they better have some good townhouse design in their jurisdiction. And so this is one that's kind of in the northwest part of their county, and how you'll take notice here how those units are fronting a green. Just imagine being the homeowner there, and instead of waking up and seeing, driveways, you do see the green out front. So design standards or design considerations like that can certainly make a space. So just some examples. This is actually multifamily development that is, I think they're duplexes or triplexes all together. And again, how they've approached that kind of back of house service provision. So that's it for that. Nothing for you to consider now, but just trying to get some perspective. Are these standards that the city wants to continue to look at? Staff's perspective is certainly that we do, and this would be a task, amongst all of TRC. This isn't just a planning thing. We've got to consider fire and public services and engineering and all of those other services. So just want to bring that for you for some information. And that's all.
Question, comments? Yes.
Chairman Hudson, this is Councilman Jefferson, President County 4. Good to see everyone. Thank you so much for this. This is an incredible presentation. I got to look at the slide decks a while before coming here, and there were a couple things I wanted to kind of chat about.
Sure.
So first, I want to say how much appreciate the sidewalk width standards and the multifamily ground floor use standards. I think those are directly in line with what we envision, especially for our growth in the Catalyst District in downtown. And seeing some of those improvements made, it's stuff that we've kind of been driving and wanting to see more and more of, so thank you for that. What I'm curious about is just the process for adoption and implementation. I imagine there are going to be a number of things, or properties, I should say, that get grandfathered in, just because it's a matter of they've already been there, and what do you do about that? I also know there's other places where some of this adoption on sidewalk width maybe just has to do with where we're looking at our Main Street study and some of our complete streets that we'll do there to make it more multimodal and accessible and things of that nature. So that's one thing that's sort of percolating in my mind, and what does that look like? And maybe our timeline for some of this just says, okay, we're kind of rezoning to understand what this could look like, and as we understand things better by and by, then with the Main Street study, we'll be able to address some of that. And then the other piece I'm thinking about is sort of the cost burden sharing on the infrastructure requirements, specifically sidewalks that we're saying with developments. And granted, these are just thoughts. I know you said on the single family, but just, I guess as the conversation goes, at some point, what we've got to begin to not begin, but make sure that's a consideration, or that as we ask developers to include sidewalks, it drives up costs for them. Those costs get pushed onto homeowners, home buyers, tenants, things of that nature. And so just thinking about that part of the conversation, because, I often think, man, yeah, I love to live in the neighborhoods that have the open spaces and sidewalks and all that, and I love it. And then you think to yourself, well, in someone's mind, are those considered amenities that they're willing to pay for? And in other developments, are home buyers and tenants maybe saying those are amenities I don't want to pay for? And so I am curious about that and how that weighs in. following this to some kind of conclusion, not a natural conclusion, but just a conclusion, if you said, well, every development has to be kind of like this, then we make the assumption that everyone who lives in those developments wants those things, are willing to pay for those amenities, because even if they want them or don't want them, they're paying for it. But again, I'm not leaning either way. It's just
Sure.
the thoughts that are sort of percolating in my mind.
Yeah, if I can answer your first question. So first, any of these this Main Street standard or the sidewalks, those would be done through text amendments. And so we're proposing that these amendments, which is the packet that I provided there, would go to the Planning Commission in April, and then before City Council sometime in May, probably. So those that's a fairly quick change, fairly easy in terms of process. The great consideration about if you introduce new use standards, what happens to existing uses? They would become what are called non-conforming uses. And we have provisions within our development ordinance that address non-conforming uses. And that there's not we don't have some sort of amortization where you have to do this, we're not going to require Rowella to go out there and, evict some people and say, all right, now we got to put in ground floor retail. Those would be permitted to continue. There's a certain provision for expansion. As long as that use doesn't cease for a period of time, they're fine to keep going. So any of those existing multifamily, there might only be 2 in that entire district, that they would be fine to keep going. The sidewalk widths, we're not increasing sidewalk widths at all from what's currently in the ordinance. So there were just kind of the carve out for those streets that are shown in yellow here. Those ones would be decreased. So the developer wouldn't have to provide as large of a sidewalk along those streets in yellow. So we're not proposing to go any greater than what's currently required.
We're saying that right now, everything we're looking at that's blue, the text amendment says 12, but you're not saying that they're 12 feet right now.
Correct, yeah. No, they're not 12 feet right now.
The text amendment says 12 right now.
Yeah, so if I'm proposing to develop a property in the Main Street or in the mixed-use district, and I only have a 4-foot sidewalk, but I'm putting in a new building, I have a site plan, I would be required to expand that sidewalk to 12 feet. We're not saying that you have to go and dig up your sidewalk now and add 8 feet if you've only got a 4-foot sidewalk. This would only, there are certain points, trigger points where these standards would apply. So if you came in with a new site plan, we're building a new building in some of these districts, then this standard would apply. If somebody only has a 5-foot sidewalk now and they're not doing anything on their site, they're not penalized for, having to put in a bigger sidewalk.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I guess for us on council, just a consideration at some point, as we're attracting more development and catalyzing the growth there. You certainly hope that something like that doesn't ever become some kind of inhibition that stops someone from doing that, but I guess you just want to be mindful of it in those conversations. Because I love the standards to be very, very clear. And I guess what I'm thinking about is where it makes sense to support sort of cost burden sharing, so.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just to clarify, just to repeat what you've heard is, that's what's currently in place right now, is if someone is coming in to develop. And so we've had those conversations with folks who've been expressing interest down there, and we haven't received any feedback that's negative to date. How this was born was developers who were trying to come in were trying to comply with the 12-foot, and it just didn't make any sense. It was pushing the sidewalk up against the street, or it was from the building to the street, and it was just a big hunk of concrete there in the way. So far, so good, but noted, what you've said is, in the future, if someone says that extra 4 feet of sidewalk is going to be a financial burden for us, we'll certainly work to find a compromise where we can accommodate, keeping the standard and allowing them to come in as well.
And a lot of these streets are tight streets, like Richardson Street. If you put four more feet on each side and put 8 feet, it's a 1-lane road by then. These are smaller streets.
Yeah, and I was actually looking at Appling Way, and I was like, well, if Appling Way is 12 feet on each sidewalk, that's interesting. Yeah.
Good work.
Any other questions?
I have one, I'm sure it's for transportation more than you. I've had a lot of questions lately about sidewalks and where we place them and where we don't place them. And most of the questions are about East Chester, West Chester. And usually my answer is, I don't want sidewalks on East Chester because I don't want you walking beside somebody that's driving 50 miles an hour. That's not my goal. So how do we decipher where to put sidewalks? Because we're still requiring developers to build sidewalks on East Chester, but there are huge areas that don't have sidewalks. So I imagine that's transportation.
Yeah, so I'll answer at least in application to the development ordinance, because there's kind of two approaches, but the development ordinance, when new development is happening, does require that sidewalks be built along thoroughfares and then in certain scenarios. So, maybe on one side of a street in a residential development, that sort of thing. But by and large, anytime that there's new development, the ordinance requires that there's new sidewalk put in. There may be gaps where you see a sidewalk and you're like, well, that's a sidewalk to nowhere. Well, the development ordinance didn't require sidewalks at a certain time. So as new standards are being applied to new development, the hope would be that you're piecing together a network. The other way that sidewalks are built is if the city has a project that's either through transportation or engineering. I know that they've done some design on sidewalks. So, there could be an actual, project when a street's being reconstructed or repaired or something like that. There are certain scenarios where an exemption can be permitted, that the ordinance has the framework to allow an exemption if there's, an industrial area where there's no other sidewalks around, and you're kind of establishing policy that, okay, we recognize that maybe this industrial park, sidewalks aren't going to be a thing for a while. But they really are installed when new development happens.
Quick question, just while we're here, and this may be a silly question, so forgive my ignorance. There's not such thing as text or in the ordinance or anything like that with regards to zoning and stuff, the standards, I should say, regarding people keeping lights on. Is that a thing?
Not for there are some lighting standards in the development ordinance, but they're not about operating time or anything like that. It's essentially a measurement of the light and how strong that light is at the property line.
Yeah, sorry. So let me be very pointed in what I'm talking about here. So not having a dark downtown, right? Like having it, turning the lights on.
No.
Is that a thing? There's no such thing as a standard for that, is there?
Mr. Chairman, if I may. So, council member, there actually is. In certain parts of the country, there is. Coming from Arizona, I was talking to Councilmember Holmes earlier, some places have a dark sky ordinance because Arizona has a large view of the nighttime sky. And so there are foot candle requirements for street lights, et cetera, and certain large venues where their lights have to be off at a certain point. That's actually considered light pollution in some places. But to answer your original question, is not to our knowledge, is there any type of ordinance regarding lighting at this point in time? Sometimes you'll see those born out of, as you build residential around, say, a ballpark or a soccer, football facility, where there's concert venues and things like that. You may see, they typically get tied to sort of the noise ordinances as well, the hours and the brightness and those sorts of things. So they do exist in places, and may be appropriate in the future for High Point if the need arises.
Yeah, and that's helpful information. I think that lends itself towards the bridling of lights. I'm thinking about the unleashing of lights. like light it up, baby, downtown. Like, how do we make that happen, right? Like, how do we get all lights on? Not all lights, but you know what I mean? Like, you know, part of walking in downtown is you walk past the dark building, it feels sketchy. We've got good street lights. Street lights are good. Whoever handles that, thank y'all. But, you know, just, you know, someone turns their lights on. And, you know, I was riding through Jamestown the other night, good old Jamestown, and they've got lights galore. I mean, people have, it's like they have Christmas lights up 365. And I was just like, man, this is such a well-lit downtown. So many of the establishments, though, that have lights on at like 8 o'clock at night, they're closed, but they've got like these lights on that make it feel like, I mean, I don't know, it just does something to you. It doesn't feel dark and all that. So I almost wonder, you know, like, how do we go about doing that? Even if it's not something that you've acquired, how do you incentivize it, or how do you, I mean, I don't know. I know it could get very expensive, but I guess this is why we invest in having our own nuclear plants, right?
It's almost like you want to ignite the night.
Ignite the night. Ignite the night. Did you put that on the t-shirt?
Not yet. It's just trademark though.
Is that a part of the marketing task? Yeah. Is that it, Ryan? Ignite the night? Oh, I can't say that
All right.
yet. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anything further? Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Great discussion. Our next item is a discussion of the disparity study, and this, I was thinking this would be July, sorry.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I'm not Eric Omedo, but I'm filling in for him today. At the end of the last P&L committee, staff was kind of felt that they should bring back information about an RFP, how that would work, and to get some direction on moving forward. To remind everyone, a disparity study is essentially documents inequity in the public contracting procurement process, analyzes that against the market, and then helps to come up with recommendations on how to correct that. So a disparity study is not a requirement for a city in North Carolina. It does help to provide support for your MWBE program if you're going to go above and beyond what we are already authorized to do by the state. A RFP process for this type of study would fit in that normal 90-day time frame. So that's, once we get the go-ahead, that would kick off that timeline. I will tell you there's about 6 firms nationwide that are doing this. So I would probably allow about 6 weeks response time, knowing that those firms are currently engaged in other cities across the country, and there are a lot of requests coming their way about this. Also, if you've dealt with any professional services lately, they're having staffing issues just like the rest of us are. So there's kind of that purpose for that 90-day time frame. As far as budget goes, we've brought you numbers in the past. I don't think those numbers have changed very much. Greensboro, Guilford County both completed a study for about $300,000. Back in 2019, Winston-Salem's cost $330,000. So I don't know, I can't give you a definitive number, but I can tell you it's probably going to be around that $300,000 cost. And that would be part of the reason to bring this to your attention is that it's not currently a budgeted item, right? So you have some options. You are still working on ARPA allocations. We are in the planning process for next year's budget, so we wanted to kind of bring this before we just start talking about budget with you all. So with all that said, staff is asking the committee to determine if this is something you want to direct staff to go forward with, if you'd like to recommend moving forward with the process, staff would do that. And I think the idea is for it to go from here with a positive recommendation to the city council. Yeah.
Yeah, so Chairman Hudson, if I can speak on this, I think the last meeting that we had where we spoke about this, we considered how this, just in terms of timing, ARPA dollars with the American Rescue Plan Act, the very, language of that when it was passed and enacted and the funding then funneled down through governments. And the spirit of it and in the letter of it was to support these kinds of ends, I think, which is to continue to help America bounce back from the pandemic and do it in a way that addresses inequities and disparities. And so I find that while we've got the funding opportunity that is so itself mostly designated for these kinds of things, and whilst we are in the midst of all the learning we're doing through our One High Point Commission and the incredible research that group is doing, to me, it seems the very natural sort of thing in line to move forward with it. In terms of how the timing itself spells out and works together, if it's something that, as funding comes through and then kind of, goes in there. I mean, I'm fine with us having a discussion and making the recommendation for it to go to the full council level to approve it. And the timeline of when we do it, I think can be sort of further worked out amongst council and staff to try to make sure it's being used and done at the right time. But I like to make a motion that we actually recommend approving using funding that's from the ARPA dollars for the disparity study. I make the motion that we take that to council.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion?
No, I just, to follow up with Councilman Jefferson, the policy directives of One High Point explicitly looked at how minority-owned firms interact with the city and how contracts are distributed and access to those things. And I think, the fact that the city is moving forward with an NWBE department and someone who's going to come on to directly manage this process, I think having that, moving forward with this, I think is just a culmination of several moving parts that will benefit each other. So, and one of the directives from council to the One High Point Commission was if there's anything that we can move on prior to the delivery of the final report, then we would do that. And so I think this gives us a chance to deliver not only on multiple initiatives at the same time. So I definitely support moving forward.
Excellent. Can I ask a question? If we say to use ARPA dollars, are we handcuffing ourselves to using ARPA dollars, and then if we don't use it, we can't proceed?
I don't, not necessarily handcuffing yourself. I think you're just being very clear on the source of funds. So if the source of funds were to change, then it would need to come back before you. But if the goal is to use ARPA dollars, then I think that's a clear direction from, the committee and then council to use that. Anything else?
So the only thing I would add is that if the council decides to use ARPA dollars, would bring back a grant project ordinance to actually budget those dollars. And so there would be a second action that would have to occur. So I don't know if y'all want to clarify, are you suggesting to move forward with a disparity study and using ARPA in two separate actions, or if that might be one action? I don't know if that would cause confusion.
If we say it has to come from ARPA, then.
Yeah, we can, I mean, we can separate it to make it easier. So I'll make, do I need to make two separate motions here? You want to make two separate motions?
If that's what you want to, so the motion on the table will need to fail if we're going to do a substitute motion. So you want to, because there's been a motion.
Is there not there's not a way for me to redress my motion?
Right, a substitute motion.
You can make a substitute.
Right.
I can make a substitute to my own motion? Robert's rules is incredible. I'll make a substitute motion.
Your motion, if it's okay with him.
Just say what you want to do.
Yeah, listen, I'm making a substitute motion to my original motion that I would like for us to move forward and making the recommendation to do the disparity study.
Second.
Regardless of using.
Well, we're two separate actions. I'm gonna come back for.
All right, there's a motion and a second, and this is to move forward with the recommendation only. So any discussion on that? If not, all in favor?
No, I'm still a little bit confused. Yeah, okay.
So the substitute motion does not designate the source of funds. It's
Right.
just to approve moving forward with the disparity study. Is that right?
But we don't know how much this disparity study is going to cost.
The estimate, I think, is.
We've gotten those numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, they've
Can you
presented
remind
to
me
us
what
on
the
those
numbers
numbers.
are?
Sure. So if I'm just giving you an estimate because we have to wait for the results to come back in, but it would be between that 3 and 350 number.
$350,000 to do.
300 would be my best estimate based on recent studies, but professional services have gone up over the past year and a half, 2 years. Audit fees, everything else is up. I don't know why the disparity study wouldn't be, but that seems to be what our neighboring communities have paid recently for their studies.
Okay. Okay, so I understand there's a motion and a second. So I'm kind of wondering, my thoughts are, I don't know if I feel comfortable this committee saying recommendation to approve it to the entire council without the entire council speaking about it. So how can I handle that? Because I really feel like.
Full council.
It'll go
I
to
know,
the council.
but you're wanting to make it as with the recommendation of approving.
You can pull, if it's on a consent agenda, so if
Yeah.
you want to pull it out when it goes to full council, we can do that. So that it be.
Or
Yeah,
can't you
so-
can't you just send it to full council without making any recommendation?
If that's your desire, I think certainly that if there is a recommendation for approval to move forward, that the plan is for it to be on consent, since that's kind of the process that we've been using now, because there'll be, the second item's a vote item as well, so there'll be 2 items then that will be on consent.
And then will there be
And then
2
you-
items that you have to vote on? Because I just don't want to repeat some of the stuff in the past. So I just want it super clear. I want us to figure this out and then move forward. So,
So at the council meeting, you could pull it out for the consent so that there is discussion for all of council.
okay,
Yeah, this is the recommendation that it goes to council for council to then
okay,
discuss.
okay.
And if, yeah, so there
But with
generally
no,
would not
but
be
you can do it with no
discussion.
recommendation.
There would generally not be discussion for consent items, usually just like how finance goes and everything's on consent. That's a good example because there's multiple items there. But a council member may always pull something out of the consent agenda and have a discussion before
Okay,
the entire
okay,
council
okay.
at the meeting.
All right, that sounds
I'll
good.
do that at the meeting, I'll just
Yeah,
pull it out.
or I will. I'm happy to too. So, okay, sounds good.
So the motion is to simply put it to give a recommendation to full
Perfect.
council. So, all in favor? Any
Aye.
opposed? That motion passes.
I'll make another motion that ARPA funding be used, I guess, I make the motion that ARPA funding be discussed at the next council meeting to be used to fund this item.
Say that
Can
again.
we just wait until the council meeting to make that recommendation? I mean, it doesn't have to come.
Yeah.
Well, because,
if
but
you
the
have-
thing, you don't think it has to, because ultimately what we want to ensure is that it gets to that council meeting for discussion. Because the only thing that'll happen is we'll talk about it, and if we approve doing a disparity study, then we say, well, what funding do we want to use? Well, let's go back and sort of mold that over and go back to P&L. It's kind of like, I don't know, it just takes this whole process over and over and over again. I think, I mean, it says here, since October 2020, so 2 years, 2.5 years of us having this discussion about what the cost is and what the disparity study is. It's literally, and at the time it was, do we want to, in a COVID year where we had a $7 million shortfall, take $250,000 to use on a disparity study? That's what was said, and it makes sense, you're right, we don't want to do that then. Now in 2023, the millions of dollars that are supposed to be to address disparities and inequities, what I'm saying is use that to fund it. So I think it needs to go ahead and go to full council.
Yeah, and I think also this is, we did not take the opportunity to partner with Guilford County and Greensboro when it was available. That would have defrayed some of the cost to us. And I think, with, now that we have these funds available, it doesn't seem very responsible of us to go back and make this a budget item when we have this money earmarked specifically for these events.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, so my motion is for it to be funded through ARPA.
Second.
There's a motion and a second on the floor. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Our last item is approval of the aesthetic. I've been waiting all week to say that word. Design elements for North Elm.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir, I'll kick it off quickly. So the item before you is for the committee to consider directing staff to draft a resolution regarding design elements for the North Elm Street portion of the race grant that we're all pleased that we have. Specifically, the section between Commerce and Sunset. That'll be sort of their streetscape elements, the complete street, multimodal, design elements that will go into that piece. Based on previous conversation with tremendous amounts of awesome lighting to complement the same. So with your permission, Chairman, I'd like to ask Mr. Trevor Spencer, your engineering services director, to just sort of go through some of those elements and maybe a little bit of the history of how this diagram before you came to be.
All right, thank you, Damon. Good morning, everyone. As Damon mentioned, this item is going to focus on the aesthetic design elements that will be incorporated into the future Elm Street Corridor project. Just a little bit of background on how we got to this point. Transportation Task Force was actually put together by Mayor Wagner probably 2 years ago. There was representation from city staff, council, and Forward High Point. as part of that task force. And at that time, Forward High Point had actually brought, I would say, 24 options as far as aesthetic elements that could be incorporated into the, at that time, shortcoming Elm Street project. Since then, the Elm Street project was actually incorporated into the RAISE grant application. Thankfully, that was awarded to the city, and so now that time frame for delivering the streetscape project was pushed out, but the good thing is that the corridor limits were extended dramatically. So previously, that corridor would have only touched essentially from English Street to Westwood, and now we're extending it north all the way to Sunset, adjacent to the library, and as far south as Commerce Street. So with that, this item focuses specifically on the aesthetic elements, not necessarily the cross-section design elements. When I speak about cross-section, we're talking about sidewalks, a lot of what Chris spoke with earlier on the planning side. So maybe sidewalks, multi-use path, bike lanes, travel lanes. What we're talking about here are the actual materials and design elements that will achieve the overall vision of what that corridor will look like whenever you are walking down that multi-use path or biking down that bike lane or driving through there or using on-street parking, maybe using the seating there off of the multi-use path in between what will be multi-use path and also landscape planters. So this will help us achieve what we spoke about earlier on the planning side of things with this project through the RAISE grant application. So as an update to that and where we are in that process, we're actually going through the RFQ selection now for our design engineer that will be involved with delivering the design for the future construction of the project. Be about a 15-month design period for that. Draw your attention to the image on the screen there, which is titled Concept Plan number A-1. This was the chosen one by that task force. And so as you look at that, don't necessarily look specifically at the street portion of it, but more so the call outs of what those lines go to. Those visuals are actually what are proposed as the used materials or overall aesthetic of what would be achieved throughout that corridor. And I will say that there will be throughout the cross section of the street some constraints that we'll have to work around from a design standpoint based off of, say, vicinity of buildings to the existing street that have not been redeveloped yet. So we will have to work around some of those. So the cross section may change as you go through the corridor in some sections, but this will be the overall general approach.
And Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, so those specific items that you see on the call-outs are not necessarily what would be there. So for example,
So we don't get an F-150 on the street, is what you're saying?
there's a very high probability there could be one, but so for example, say the statue, the artistic rendering, those things will certainly be different. But I can almost promise you we can get an F-150 down there, for sure. So we'll craft, if it's the will of the committee, we'll craft a resolution that just basically uses this as a concept for elements to be included, and then we'll want all kinds of public input and of course from the council as well on what final elements actually get put in there. But conceptually, this is what was kind of put out there originally as Trevor described, and we want to make sure to just sort of memorialize that with the resolution that the city will move forward in keeping with its word and what was put out previously, and then of course with lots of public input on what the final product looks like.
I love it in so many ways, extending it from Sunset to Commerce. I think does a great job of creating that connection corridor we wanted from the university, quite frankly, through our Catalyst district, even right into our showroom district, where Commerce is at. And so, that whole connection, I love that, to be honest. I'm curious, and maybe I missed this part. So the segments you have there that are pink with the dots on both ends, I see on the left side of the picture near the district sign, and then on the right side of the picture way at the end. I may have missed, what are those pink line segments?
Those would have been previously the extents of the original streetscape.
Say it one more time.
Those were the previous extents of the streetscape prior to the raised grant application extending the project limits. So this rendering, this concept here was provided by Forward High Point close to 2 years ago. But I would say that for the purposes of the adoption of these elements, those pink lines, they don't really carry any weight or bearing on this.
So that all can change, it's just the concept.
Correct.
Right, yeah.
Anything further? While we're all in the same room again, I'll ask, does this include the concept of an urban way that connects the Greenway to the Southwest Greenway?
Yes, sir. So the
That's
multi-use.
still on our minds? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Actually, it's a key element
I-
to tie into the
Good.
Southwest Heritage Greenway.
Good.
And yes, sir,
Yeah.
absolutely.
This is so close to where the bike lane at the Children's Museum right now ends with Armstrong Park. That I would hate to do so much work and then say, you know, we really should have put that urban way right through this section. So long as that's the goal, that makes me very happy to hear.
I will take it one step further in that the multi-use path that is proposed on the west side of the Elm Street corridor is an absolute requirement for the grant. So that connection will have to be delivered in order for us to qualify for the reimbursement for federal dollars.
And we have a plan to connect Hamilton to Elm?
Yes.
Make that connection for that greenway?
Yes, we do. There will actually be an extension of the sidewalk. If you've noticed recently, as part of the ongoing Cubain project, the sidewalk has been widened on the north side of Cubain between Hamilton and Main, and also extended all the way down to Blaine, which will eventually connect to the Armstrong Park location. So the additional sidewalk will be added adjacent to the library with added width at a future date. That will likely happen ahead of construction of the raised grant project.
Okay, so what you just, so I'm picturing everything you just said. Armstrong Park feeds up back there, up to like Blaine, right up in there, Ferris and Blaine, carries you out to Blaine to Cubain Avenue, carries up an extended sidewalk all the way through Hamilton, past the old Cloverleaf and Walgreens right there, through Main Street, through the library, and then connects onto Elm, right?
Yes, sir. Yep, you're correct.
Very nice.
So the urban way goes right by the library now.
Perfect.
And through love it. I love it.
And then we'll put it on those rail lines on the south side, man, this is gonna be perfect.
So this actually does cross the railroad track. Correct? Not where, yeah. So that's
It's
how,
over it.
that's how we're getting over to the southwest.
I know.
We did it. You need us to recommend approval or adoption of this?
Please.
Do we? Oh, okay.
I make a motion to recommend, I make a motion to adopt.
If you just include in your resolution, yeah, I resolve to, direct staff to provide a resolution for the city council regarding design aesthetics of Northtown, or something like that.
So,
This just has to carry.
I was gonna say, can my motion be, I make a motion to do what you just said?
You can, yes, sir.
Sorry, efficiency.
Mary, don't write that down.
Mary will get it.
What he said.
Yeah, no, seriously, everything you said, the resolution come to council.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was writing, but my pen couldn't capture what you were saying that fast, and
Second.
All right, there is a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
I do have one more thing to say. I just want to make sure that, and I know you've kind of said it just concept only, because since this drawing, out of the November 2022 retreat, we kind of also stated about whole design and art. So I just want to make sure, because not all of this is very current, so I want to make sure that we include High Point by Design, and make sure that we're very, very design and art focused on this rendering.
Yes,
On
ma'am.
what we
It'll-
actually do.
It'll be written in generic terms, again,
Yeah,
just
okay.
referencing the elements, the actual element itself, not what the element will be.
Perfect, okay, thanks.
And I think that kind of is what they're demonstrating. There's a piece of public art, there's a piece of,
Right.
the design in, plus the design around the landscaping. I think you're saying we want to make this as open as possible to,
Yes, sir.
yeah. Anything else? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Anything further?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, guys.
If not, thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Are we off? Let's just-